The problem is not that there's inadequate spending. The problem is what it is that's being produced and where in the structure of production it's being produced. So we have too much up here, too little up here. We need resources to move from one stage to another. Simply borrowing a lot of money and blowing it on politically arbitrary projects does nothing to correct these imbalances. If anything, it intensifies the imbalances because it will prop up some of the very firms that the economy needs to be liquidated right now. So a lot of construction firms need to be liquidated. We got way too many construction firms, and yet now they're getting a shot in the arm by the government. That is not what the economy needs. What the economy needs now is for prices and wages to be free to fluctuate. You do not interfere with prices. That's how the market readjusts after a downturn like this. We want no emergency lending whatsoever, because again, that's just going to prop up malinvestment that we don't want. We instead want the economy to be able to clear itself out as rapidly as possible. Now, again, when I use the word arbitrary, I mean that. The projects that the government devotes its stimulus money to are arbitrary because the government has no profit and loss mechanism. How does it get its money? It just takes it from us. That's not profit and loss. That's just seizure. So how does it know it's producing anything that the people want? You know, I mean, I bet you if I took all your money, I would try to argue that what I'm going to produce with it is exactly what you want, but maybe you might feel differently. So everything they do is totally arbitrary, for one thing, and what they do is taken from the private sector. Now, the sophisticated Keynesians will come back with the argument that, well, the private sector is just limp right now, so there are no opportunity costs to just blowing a lot of this money, because what we're doing is we're taking idle resources and we're putting them back into use. So that's fine. So in other words, don't worry that if the government spends a lot on a bridge project, that it's competing with the private sector over steel resources or labor. Steel is idle and labor's idle, so we can just take it, no harm done. But the two problems with this idle resource argument. Number one, why are the resources idle? There's, again, no answer to this question. No, the question is not even attempted to be answered. Why are there all of a sudden idle resources? Again, when the market selects for the best entrepreneurs, why are they all of a sudden so incompetent that the economy is full of idle resources nobody knows what to do with? Anybody, so there's no attempt even to answer the question. Could it be that the idle resources are themselves the product of a previous massive entrepreneurial miscalculation? Where does a massive systemic entrepreneurial miscalculation come from, if not from the distortion of investment patterns brought about by the Fed's intervention? So the idle resource problem there is we have to look for where it comes from. But secondly, how can you make sure that the projects the government spends the money on are going to use resources that are exactly the ones that are idle? So that when they're building bridges, they're going to take unemployed financial services people and have them build the bridges? I mean, how do they make sure? Of course, there's no way to do that. So any way they build these projects, they are going to be drawing from resources from areas where the consumers more urgently wanted them to be employed. And finally, let's consider the case of a guy who opens a restaurant around the time of the Olympics in Vancouver, and he doesn't realize the Olympics are going on. So he just thinks everybody loves his restaurant. So he thinks, I better open another location. And then the Olympics leave town, and his other location is dead. I mean, his waitresses have no business. They're all standing around idle. Well, yeah, he's got idle resources. Should we want to stimulate those back into existence, back into activity? No. What a waste. What a total waste and diversion of scarce resources that would be. No. We want those resources to be redeployed elsewhere. Now, finally, given that I guess I'm probably down to 4-ish minutes, so ultimately, the fiscal stimulus stuff just puts additional strain on the private sector. It's like drinking Red Bull instead of sleeping. It's not, the crash is still coming, right? I mean, there's no shortcut there. And then if we look through American history, if we look at examples of even though I think you can argue this a priori, nevertheless, if you look at examples in American history, the economy has recovered consistently without fiscal stimulus. I mean, in the 50s, Eisenhower cut the budget a couple of times in the face of an economic downturn. Things turned right around. And the textbooks would tell you, oh, no, that's going to cut aggregate demand and stuff. Well, the textbooks are wrong. We look at the 1980s, Reagan he had some fiscal stimulus in the form of lower marginal tax rates, but he had a contractionary monetary policy. And the economy was fine. Clinton wanted to have a stimulus package in the wake of the Bush the first recession, but he didn't have the votes for it, and the economy turned around. So, but I think the key example is 1920 to 21. Nobody remembers this depression. In fact, even Wikipedia will have an entry on the third wife of the second drummer of Journey and what she did for a living. But up until earlier this year, there was no mention whatsoever of the Great Depression of 1920-21. No surprise, because this is exactly the opposite of what they want us to learn about. Because in 1920-21, you had double-digit unemployment, you had production figures going through the floor. It was a disaster. And now we're told, without fiscal monetary stimulus, this is just going to have a deflationary spiral and all this stuff. Well, what did the government do? Well, from 1920 to 1922, they cut the government budget in half. Cut it in half. So we should never have recovered from this, according to the conventional wisdom. The Fed stayed out of it. No attempt to use its money creation powers to reverse the downturn whatsoever. So they cut the budget, they cut top marginal tax rates, they cut the debt. National debt was cut by 1/3. And the result was an extremely swift and robust recovery by late 1921. Now, do we ever hear this mentioned? No, we hear an awful lot about the need to learn from history, but it's funny how they select the lessons very, very carefully, and then they learn the wrong ones from the lessons they've chosen. So they look at the Great Depression, and they look at this episode where this is the first time in American history where the government said, you know what, we're going to roll up our sleeves and solve this thing, and it persists for years. And they draw no conclusions from this other than we didn't do enough. Or they draw the conclusion that, and I know I'm down to the very end, so I'm going to say my most controversial thing for the end that I don't have time to defend unless somebody asks me a question about it. That's my way of cheating here, getting a few extra minutes. But there will be people who say, well, World War II finally got us out of that because of all the spending. Well, two quick things about that. The second thing I'm going to say first is that after World War II ended, all the Keynesian economists warned us that we were going to have terrible, terrible economic times because the government was cutting its budget by 2/3, and so everything is just going to be a disaster. Well, to the contrary, 1946 was the single most robust year for the private economy in American history. So much for Paul Samuelson. But secondly, the idea that World War II got us out of the Depression is so absurdly wrong that even textbook authors are catching up to this. And normally a textbook author, you've got to take an ice pick to his head to get any new research into it. But the recent research, including Bob Higgs's book from Oxford University Press, Depression, War, and Cold War, argues first, yeah, the unemployment statistics go down because 12 million people are drafted. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to understand this. Secondly, if you're going to take these GDP statistics from the war years seriously, which I don't see how you can, the statistics are all phony. For a reason I'll get to in a real second, I hope I can be indulged for 2 more minutes. But according to this, at a time when the best workers in the labor force were suddenly and abruptly removed from the economy and shipped overseas and replaced by teenagers and women with very little work experience and elderly men, that's when we had the most robust double-digit growth in all of American history that has never been repeated before or since. What? I mean, right away you should say, all right, so obviously there's something wrong with the statistics. And then secondly, the same statistics that tell us things were great in World War II tell us we had a depression in 1946. There was no depression in 1946. If you look at the private economy, which is what matters, I don't care how many bozo things the government is producing, but the private economy that produces for our consumption, if you look there, it was very robust. Why are the figures so screwed up? Well, first of all, GDP is a very misleading aggregate in the first place, but it's going to add up prices of goods. Now, look at how pricing occurs during World War II. It's not the kind of pricing that occurs when you and I buy a breakfast cereal and supply and demand gives us a price. It's the government and some military firm come up with basically an arbitrary price for something the government's going to buy. So they add up a bunch of arbitrary prices, and voila, we have this magical prosperity of the war period. But in fact, it was a period of rationing, of consumers cutting back, and of taking goods and destroying them. I mean, if this were the way to become prosperous, then I'll leave you with this thought. The best thing we could do right now for the economy would be for the U.S. and Japan to build the most spectacular, gleaming naval fleets ever seen in the history of the world, and then sail them out into the Pacific, and then we'll evacuate everybody from the ships, and then we'll sink them to the bottom of the ocean and congratulate ourselves about how much richer we have become. So, thank you very much.